The candles had not yet finished burning down when the whispers started. Elinor Vane felt them before she heard them, a change in the air of the ballroom, like a window opening somewhere far away. She kept her chin level and her hands folded in front of her gray silk dress, the only dress she owned that did not show its mending at the seams. Across the floor, the Duke of Rothmere was walking toward her. He was not supposed to be walking toward her. He was supposed to be standing beside Miss Charlotte Ainsley, the wealthiest unmarried woman in the county, who had spent 4 months and a small fortune preparing for this exact night. Elinor had watched Charlotte's mother arrange her daughter near the punch table an hour ago, close enough to the Duke that he could not avoid noticing her, far enough that it would not look arranged at all. It had looked arranged anyway. Everyone in the room knew it. Everyone in the room had been waiting for the Duke to cross those few feet of floor and ask Charlotte Ainsley to open the dancing. Instead, his boots were coming toward Elinor, and the whispers spread out from the center of the room like water finding the lowest point. She noticed the chalk dust on the floorboards first. A groundskeeper had powdered the wood earlier in the evening to help dancing slippers glide, and he had done it unevenly near the west wall, leaving a pale smear just past her left foot. She stared at that smear as if it were the most important thing in Hampshire. It was easier than staring at him. "Miss Vane." His voice was quieter than she expected, not soft, exactly, controlled. The voice of a man who had spent his whole life being listened to and had grown careful about what he allowed people to hear. She looked up. Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Rothmere, was tall in the particular way that made rooms rearrange themselves around him, though tonight it was not his height that struck her. It was that his eyes were fixed on her and not, as every other man's eyes in that room seemed to be, somewhere just past her shoulder, calculating whether she was worth the trouble of a full conversation. "Your Grace," she said, and dropped the smallest curtsy that manners would permit. "I would like to request a dance, a simple waltz, nothing more complicated than that." Nothing more complicated than that. As if a waltz between a duke and a bankrupt baronet's daughter, in front of 300 guests who had come specifically to watch who he chose, could ever be simple. Elinor's father had lost the family's money 2 winters ago, in a series of investments that everyone in the county still discussed at length whenever they thought she could not hear them. Her mother had stopped attending balls altogether, unable to bear watching her daughter wear altered dresses among women who had never worn the same gown twice in a season. Elinor had come tonight only because her aunt had insisted that hiding from society would not pay the debts, and because there was, if she were honest with herself, a very small and very stubborn part of her that refused to disappear simply because her family's fortune had. She had not expected to be seen. She had certainly not expected to be chosen. "Your Grace," she said again, because it bought her a moment to think, "I believe Miss Ainsley has been waiting for the opening dance." Something flickered across his face there and gone, too quick to name. "Miss Ainsley will have other dances tonight. I am asking you." Behind him she could see heads turning. Charlotte Ainsley's mother had gone very still, the particular stillness of a woman recalculating an entire evening's strategy in the space of a single breath. Elinor's own aunt, seated near the older ladies, had pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. Refusing him was not truly possible. A woman did not refuse a duke's public request without creating a scandal far larger than the one she would create by accepting it. And yet accepting it meant stepping into the center of every eye in the room, in a dress that had been let out at the waist twice, with a family name that had become a byword for foolish spending and worse luck. She thought absurdly of the chalk dust again, of how it did not care whose slipper crossed it. It only marked the floor, indifferent to rank or ruin. "A simple waltz," she repeated, "then I accept your grace." He offered his arm. She placed her gloved hand upon it, feeling the solid warmth of him even through 2 layers of fabric, and let him lead her out into the open floor where the crowd parted like something startled. The musicians, who had been waiting for exactly this moment, lifted their bows. Elinor had danced hundreds of waltzes in her life. Her mother had drilled the steps into her from the age of 12, back when the family still had money for masters who came twice a week to correct the angle of her wrist and the placement of her chin. It had been, in those days, a kind of preparation for a future that no longer existed. A future where dancing well meant marrying well, and marrying well meant securing everything her father's later mistakes would go on to destroy. She had not danced in nearly a year, not since the last ball her family could afford to attend properly. The music began, and her body remembered before her mind did, falling into the frame of the dance as naturally as breathing. She felt the Duke's hand settle at her waist, felt her own hand rise to his shoulder, felt the first step land exactly where it should. For 1/2 of 1 second, as the room and its 300 watching eyes blurred into a single indistinct wall of candlelight and silk, Elinor Vane forgot to be afraid. She did not examine that feeling. She did not have time. The music was already carrying them both into the turn, and somewhere behind the Duke's carefully composed expression, something was watching her with an attention she did not yet understand and did not yet dare to name. The dance had only just begun. Across the room, Charlotte Ainsley's mother leaned toward another lady and murmured something behind her fan. Elinor could not hear the words. She did not need to. She had heard versions of them her whole life, in one form or another, ever since her father's ruin had become public knowledge. Words like fortune hunter, words like desperate, words that assumed a woman with no money could only want one thing from a man with a great deal of it. She kept her spine straight and her steps precise, because precision was the one thing no one could take from her. Her mother had taught her that, in the last good year before everything fell apart, if you cannot control your circumstances, control your form. No one can fault a woman for dancing correctly. The Duke's hand at her waist tightened, almost imperceptibly, as they moved through the turn nearest the west wall. She glanced up at him without meaning to and found him already watching her, his expression unreadable, his jaw set in a way that suggested he too was aware of every pair of eyes fixed upon them. Neither of them spoke. The waltz did not require speech, and for the length of that first turn, silence felt like the safest possible choice. But the silence would not last. Nothing tonight was simple, whatever he had called it, and somewhere in the watching crowd, a story was already being written about the two of them, a story neither had chosen and neither could yet stop. The music rose, the candles burned, and Elinor Vane, daughter of a ruined house, danced with a Duke as though her whole future depended on getting every step exactly right, because in a way that she could not yet fully admit to herself, it did. She had learned, over the long months since her father's ruin, that a room could turn against a person without a single word being spoken aloud. It happened in glances, in the angle of a shoulder turned just slightly away, in how quickly a conversation found a reason to end when she approached. Tonight she felt that same current moving through the crowd, except it was not turning away from her. It was turning toward her, hungry and curious, waiting to see what she would do with an attention she had not asked for and could not refuse. The Duke guided her through the next turn with an ease that suggested he had done this 1,000 times before, at 1,000 balls, with 1,000 women whose names he likely did not remember by morning. And yet something in the way he held himself now felt different from the practiced boredom she had seen in him across ballrooms for the past 3 seasons. He was, she realized with some surprise, paying attention. Truly paying attention, the way a person pays attention to something they have not yet decided whether to trust. "You dance very well, Miss Vane," he said, breaking the silence at last. "I was taught by an excellent master, Your Grace, before my family could no longer afford one." She had not meant to say the second half of that sentence. It slipped out before she could stop it, sharp and unguarded, a small crack in the composure she had spent the whole evening building. She braced for his reaction, certain she had just handed him one more reason to regret his choice. Instead, something in his expression eased, just slightly, as though her honesty had answered a question he had been quietly asking. "Most women in this room," he said, "would never have admitted that. Most women in this room have nothing to admit." His mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close enough to it that she felt the corner of her own resolve loosen for just a moment. It was a dangerous feeling, that loosening. She did not trust it, and she did not trust him, not yet, not in a ballroom full of people who would remember every second of this dance long after she and the Duke had both left the floor. The music swelled toward its final turn. She could feel the eyes of the room pressing in from every direction, could feel Charlotte Ainsley's stare boring into her back like a physical weight, could feel her aunt's anxious attention from the row of chairs near the wall. None of it mattered, not while the steps demanded her full concentration, not while the Duke's hand at her waist kept perfect, steady time. When the final note faded and he bowed over her hand, the room did not erupt into applause the way it might have for a lesser event. Instead, there was a long beat of silence, the particular silence of 300 people deciding, all at once, what story they were going to tell about what they had just witnessed. Elinor curtsied. The Duke straightened, and somewhere in that silence, before either of them had said another word, she understood that whatever had just happened on that dance floor was only the beginning of something much larger, something she had not agreed to and could not yet see the shape of. She only knew, as she was led back to her aunt's side through a crowd that watched her every step, that nothing about her life would look the same after tonight. The chalk dust on the floorboards had already been scattered by dozens of dancing feet, the mark she had stared at before the music began now lost among 100 others. But she could still feel the ghost of it beneath her slipper, steady and unbothered, the one thing in that entire glittering, whispering room that had not changed at all. The letter arrived before Elinor had even finished her morning tea, carried in by a footman whose face was carefully blank in the way servants trained themselves to be blank, when they already knew the contents of gossip that had not yet reached their masters. It was from her aunt, though her aunt lived in the very same house and could have simply walked down the stairs to speak the words aloud. She had chosen paper instead, perhaps because paper did not require Elinor to watch her face while she read it. "The whole county is speaking of nothing else," the letter began, and Elinor set down her cup before she had even finished the first line, because she already knew, with a cold certainty settling into her stomach, exactly what the rest of it would say. By the time she reached the bottom of the page, her tea had gone cold, and her hands had gone very still in the particular way they always did when she was trying not to let anyone see how deeply something had frightened her. The waltz from the night before had not simply been noticed. It had been dissected, examined, and turned into a story that bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened on that ballroom floor. According to the version now spreading through drawing rooms across 3 neighboring estates, Elinor Vane had somehow arranged the entire encounter herself, positioning her family's ruin as a kind of tragic bait that no honorable duke could resist rescuing. Some accounts had her weeping prettily near the punch table until he noticed her. Others had her mother, long since retired from society, secretly writing to the Duke's aunt to arrange the whole affair. None of it was true, all of it was now apparently believed. She thought of the Duke's steady hand at her waist, of the honest question in his eyes when she had admitted her family could no longer afford dancing masters, and felt something twist unpleasantly beneath her ribs. He had asked her to dance. She had accepted because refusing was not a real choice available to her. And now, somehow, the entire county had decided that she was the architect of her own scandal. Her mother found her still seated at the breakfast table an hour later, the letter folded into a small, tight square beside her cold tea. "I heard the servants talking," her mother said, lowering herself into the chair across from Elinor with the careful slowness of a woman who had once moved through rooms without a single thought for her joints, before worry and reduced fires and thinner meals had begun to wear at her. "Is it true? The Duke asked you to dance." "It is true that he asked. It is not true that I arranged it." "No one who knows you would believe you capable of such scheming." Her mother's mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile. "Unfortunately, very few people in this county actually know you, Elinor. They know your father's failures. They will build whatever story around you that best explains those failures." It was not said unkindly. It was simply true, and her mother had never been a woman who wasted breath-softening truths that needed to be understood clearly. "What would you have me do?" Elinor asked. "I cannot undance the waltz." Her mother was quiet for a long moment, studying her daughter's face with an expression that mixed exhaustion and calculation in equal measure, the particular look of a woman who had spent 2 years learning to think first of survival and only second of pride. "You could encourage it," her mother said finally. "The Duke's interest, whatever it truly is, if he calls again, do not discourage him." "Mother, I'm not asking you to trap the man, Elinor. I am asking you not to close a door that has, through no scheme of your own, come open in front of you. Your father's debts have not vanished simply because we no longer speak of them at dinner. A single good match could resolve what 2 years of careful economy have not." Elinor said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not sound either cruel or naive, and she had grown tired in the last 2 years of sounding like either. She spent the remainder of that morning in the small sewing room at the back of the house, where the light was good, and the door could be closed against the rest of the household's worried murmuring. She had taken out her second-best gown, the pale blue one with the hem that had begun to fray from 3 seasons of wear, and set about repairing it with small, exact stitches. It was not, strictly speaking, necessary work. The gown would not be worn again for weeks, but her hands needed something precise to hold onto, something with a clear beginning and a clear end, something that did not involve Dukes or gossip or her mother's careful, exhausted calculations about the family's future. The needle went in. The needle came out. The thread pulled taut and even. For an hour, at least, the world made sense in a way that ballrooms and letters never seemed to. She did not see the second letter until it was placed directly in her hands by her aunt that afternoon, a heavier paper, sealed with wax that bore the unmistakable pressed crest of Rothmere. Her hands went still over the fabric in her lap. "Open it," her aunt said, hovering close enough that Elinor could hear the anxious edge beneath the woman's carefully casual tone. "Whatever it says, we shall manage it. But open it, child, before I lose my composure entirely." Elinor broke the seal. The Duke's handwriting was neat, controlled, the handwriting of a man accustomed to writing things that mattered and being taken at his word. He wrote only a few lines. He hoped she had suffered no ill effect from the previous evening's attention. He wished to call upon her family, with her mother's permission, at her convenience. He signed it simply, Rothmere, with none of the elaborate flourishes she might have expected from a man of his rank. It was, on its surface, an entirely ordinary letter, a polite continuation of a polite acquaintance. And yet Elinor found her heart beating faster as she read it a second time, and then a third, searching each careful sentence for some hidden meaning she suspected was not truly there, because she wanted there to be one, and that wanting frightened her more than any gossip the county could invent. Meanwhile, across the county, in a house considerably larger and considerably colder than the Vane family's modest estate, Julian Ashcombe was enduring a very different sort of conversation. His aunt, the Dowager Duchess, had summoned him to her private sitting room the moment word of the waltz reached her, which had taken, by his estimation, somewhere close to 4 hours from the moment the last note faded in that crowded ballroom. "You danced with the Vane girl," she said, without preamble, the moment he had closed the door behind him. "I danced with Miss Vane, yes." A ruined family, a father whose foolishness is spoken of from London to the coast. You understand what this looks like, Julian. I understand what it looks like to those who have nothing better to occupy their attention than the movements of a single dance." His aunt's expression did not soften. She had raised him since he was 12 years old, since his own parents' deaths had left him a duke before he was old enough to fully understand what the title cost him, and she had never once allowed sentiment to interfere with what she considered his duty to the family name. "A duke does not simply dance with a woman like that unless he intends something by it," she said. "The whole county will expect a declaration within the month, or they will decide you have ruined the girl's already fragile reputation for sport. There is no middle path here. You have chosen a direction whether you meant to or not." He had not, in truth, considered the consequences fully when he crossed that ballroom floor. He had seen a woman standing apart from the crowd near the punch table, her spine straight despite the whispers he could see moving around her like water around a stone, and something in her stillness had struck him more forcefully than anything Charlotte Ainsley's careful, practiced charm had managed in 3 full months of pursuit. He had acted, in that moment, on instinct rather than calculation, a rare enough occurrence in his carefully managed life that he had not stopped to consider what it might cost either of them. Now, standing in his aunt's sitting room while she outlined with brutal clarity exactly what society expected of him, he understood the cost quite well. "What would you have me do?" he asked, echoing, without knowing it, the very question Elinor had put to her own mother that same morning. "Decide, Julian. Decide quickly, and decide honestly, whether you intend to court that girl properly or whether you intend to leave her exposed to every cruel tongue in this county for a single, impulsive dance. There is no comfortable middle ground left to you." He thought of Elinor's honesty on the dance floor, her admission about the dancing master her family could no longer afford, offered without artifice or calculation, the way very few women in his circle ever spoke to him anymore. He thought of the steadiness in her spine as she had crossed that floor toward him, refusing to let 300 watching eyes see her falter. He did not yet know what he intended, but he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was not sorry he had asked her to dance, whatever it cost either of them in the weeks to come. Elinor answered the Duke's letter that same evening, after an hour spent staring at a blank sheet of paper while her aunt paced the small sitting room, offering suggestions Elinor did not use and questions she could not yet answer. In the end, she wrote only a short reply, granting permission for his visit at a time convenient to him, and signed it with her name alone, offering nothing more than the letter required. She told herself the brevity was caution. She did not examine too closely whether it was also something else. The visit was arranged for 3 days hence, which gave the gossip exactly enough time to grow larger and stranger with every retelling. By the 2nd day, a woman Elinor had met only once at a neighboring assembly claimed to have heard, from a reliable source, that the Duke had already spoken to his solicitor about settlements. By the 3rd day, another version insisted the opposite, that he intended only to satisfy propriety with a single polite visit before quietly withdrawing his attention and letting the whole affair fade from memory. Elinor did not know which version to believe, if either. She only knew that she had spent 3 days rehearsing conversations in her head that she had no way of predicting, turning over sentences and discarding them, imagining his face and his voice, and finding, each time, that her memory of the waltz felt sharper and more vivid than it had any reasonable right to feel after a single dance and 2 brief letters. Her mother, meanwhile, had thrown herself into a frenzy of quiet preparation, instructing the housekeeper to polish silver that had not been polished in months, fretting over which room would best receive a duke, worrying aloud about whether their remaining tea service was fine enough for the occasion. Elinor watched her mother's careful, exhausting hope with an ache she could not quite name, aware that whatever happened during the Duke's visit, her mother's entire sense of the family's future now rested upon it. That was perhaps the heaviest part of it all, not the gossip, which would fade in time as gossip always did, replaced eventually by some fresher scandal. Not even her own uncertain feelings, which she had not yet allowed herself to examine too closely. It was the weight of her family's hope, pressed onto a single visit, a single conversation, a single man whose intentions she could not yet read clearly enough to trust. On the morning of the third day, Elinor rose before the rest of the household and walked alone through the small garden behind the house, where the early frost had not yet burned away and her breath showed faintly in the cold air. She stood there for a long while, watching the mist settle over the bare hedges, trying to decide what she actually wanted from the day ahead, separate from what her mother wanted, separate from what the gossiping county expected, separate even from what the Duke himself might want. She wanted, she realized slowly, to be seen honestly, not as a scheme, not as a rescue, not as a scandal to be managed or a fortune to be secured. She wanted, improbably and perhaps foolishly, for the man who had crossed a crowded ballroom to choose her honestly, to see her the same way he had seen her on that dance floor, before either of them understood what the county would make of it. It was a dangerous thing to want. She knew that even as she stood shivering in the frost-touched garden, watching her own breath disappear into the pale morning air, wanting things honestly, in a life that had taught her caution and control above all else, felt like standing at the edge of something she could not yet see the bottom of. She went back inside before the household woke, and by the time the Duke's carriage arrived that afternoon, precisely on time, she had composed her face into something calm and unreadable, the same careful composure she had worn through every dance, every letter, every difficult conversation of the past 2 years. Whatever the visit held, she intended to meet it standing straight, whatever it cost her. The carriage that stopped in front of the Vane house was plain enough that it did not immediately announce its owner's rank, though the crest on its door left no doubt for anyone who cared to look closely. Elinor watched it arrive from the front window, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and felt her heart begin to beat faster despite every effort to keep her breathing even. Her mother had arranged the good chairs in the small drawing room hours earlier, along with the polished tea service, and a plate of biscuits that had used nearly the last of the household's sugar. Elinor understood, watching her mother smooth an invisible wrinkle from the tablecloth for the third time, exactly how much hope had been poured into this single afternoon, and the understanding sat uneasily in her stomach alongside her own uncertain expectations. The Duke was shown into the room by a footman who could barely contain his curiosity, and for one long moment no one spoke at all. Elinor rose from her seat, as manners required, and dropped a small curtsy. He bowed in return, his expression composed in the same careful way she remembered from the ballroom, though she thought she caught something else beneath it now, some flicker of uncertainty that did not match the confident man who had crossed that crowded floor toward her. "Your Grace," her mother said, recovering first, gesturing him toward the good chair near the window, "we are honored by your visit." "The honor is mine, Mrs. Vane. I hope I am not intruding upon your afternoon." "Not at all," her mother said, in a voice pitched slightly too bright, slightly too eager, and Elinor felt a small wince of sympathy even as she kept her own face carefully neutral. Tea was poured. Polite conversation followed, the kind of careful, weightless talk that filled the space between people who had not yet decided how honest they intended to be with one another. The weather, the state of the roads after the recent rain, a distant cousin of the Duke's who had recently married into a family Elinor's mother professed to know slightly, though Elinor suspected she did not know them at all, and was simply grateful for any thread of conversation that kept the visit moving forward. It was nearly half an hour before her mother, with a suddenness that surprised even Elinor, rose and announced that she had matters requiring her attention in the kitchen, leaving the two of them alone in the drawing room with only the ticking of the mantel clock and the faint clink of teacups between them. Elinor understood immediately what her mother intended and felt a flush of embarrassment rise in her cheeks at how transparent the maneuver was. The Duke, to his credit, said nothing about it, though a small, wry curve touched the corner of his mouth that suggested he had noticed as well. "Your mother is not subtle," he said, once the door had closed behind her. My mother has spent 2 years learning that subtlety is a luxury she can no longer afford. The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with a frustration she had been carrying since the letters first arrived, and she immediately regretted them, bracing for some cool, aristocratic response that would remind her of exactly how far apart their two worlds truly sat. Instead, the Duke set down his teacup with careful precision and studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I did not come here today because your mother wished it, or because the county expects it of me," he said. "I came because I have not stopped thinking of that dance since it ended, and I wish to know whether you had thought of it as well, or whether I imagined something that was not truly there." Eleanor's breath caught. Whatever she had expected from this visit, careful diplomacy or polite obligation, or even the cold calculation her mother's letter had half hoped for, she had not expected honesty offered so plainly, without armor, in a room where the whole county's gossip hung invisible but heavy between them. "I have thought of it," she admitted before caution could stop her, "more than I intended to." Something eased in his shoulders at that, a small release of tension she would not have noticed if she had not spent the past few minutes studying him as closely as he seemed to be studying her. "Then perhaps we might speak plainly with one another," he said, "rather than performing whatever roles the county has already decided we should play. Plainly, Your Grace, my family is ruined, and half the county believes I engineered our dance for exactly the reason my mother privately hopes it might succeed. I do not know how to speak plainly about that without it sounding either bitter or calculating, and I find I do not wish to be either in front of you." "Then do not be either. Simply be honest and let me decide for myself what to make of it." It was, she thought, either the kindest thing anyone outside her own family had said to her in 2 years, or the most dangerous, and she was not entirely certain there was a meaningful difference between the two. They spoke for nearly an hour after that, longer than propriety strictly allowed for an unmarried woman alone with a man of his rank, though neither seemed inclined to notice the passing time. He asked about the dancing master her family could no longer afford, and she found herself telling him, in careful, measured pieces, about the years before her father's ruin, about a childhood spent believing that precision and control were simply what was expected of a well-raised young woman, only to discover later how quickly that same precision could become armor against a world that had turned unkind. He, in turn, told her something of his own careful life, of a childhood spent learning that a duke's every word and gesture would be watched and weighed by people who wanted something from him, of the exhausting effort required to determine, in any given conversation, who genuinely wished him well and who simply wished to attach themselves to his fortune. "You are the first person in a very long while," he said, near the end of their conversation, "who has not once asked me a single question about my income, my estates, or my expectations for the coming season. I did not think it was my place to ask, Your Grace." "It is precisely your place, if you wish it to be. But I confess I find the absence of the question far more interesting than any answer I might have given." Eleanor did not know how to respond to that, and so she said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them, comfortable in a way she had not expected silence with a near stranger to feel. When her mother returned at last, flustered and transparently pleased to find the two of them still deep in conversation, the Duke rose to take his leave, promising to call again soon if Eleanor would permit it. She found, watching his carriage pull away down the narrow drive, that she very much hoped he would. But hope, she had learned over the past 2 years, was a fragile thing, easily crushed by circumstances beyond one's control, and the county's gossip had not finished with either of them yet. Word of the extended visit spread even faster than word of the waltz had, growing stranger and more elaborate with every retelling, until by the following week, Eleanor found herself unable to walk into the village shop without feeling every eye in the room turned toward her, weighing and measuring and deciding, all over again. Exactly what kind of woman she must be to have captured a duke's private attention for a full hour behind a closed drawing-room door. The pressure built steadily over the following days. Her mother grew bolder in her hints about settlements and futures secured. Her aunt fretted constantly about propriety and appearances. And somewhere in the county's great, churning machine of gossip and speculation, a decision was being made about Elinor Vane's character and intentions that she herself had never been consulted about, and could not now find any way to correct. She understood, with growing unease, that whatever honesty had passed between herself and the Duke in that quiet drawing-room, the world outside that room had already written its own version of the story, and that version was gaining ground with every passing day, regardless of what either of them actually wanted. Something would have to give. She could feel it building, the way one feels a storm gathering long before the first drop of rain falls, and she did not know yet whether she or the Duke would be the one forced to speak the truth aloud, in front of an audience that had already decided it did not want to hear it. The storm arrived, as storms often do, at another gathering entirely, a garden party hosted by a neighboring family who had clearly invited half the county, specifically in hopes of witnessing whatever might unfold between the Duke and the ruined baronet's daughter. Elinor had not wanted to attend. Her aunt had insisted, arguing that refusing the invitation would look far worse than facing the gossip directly, and so she had dressed carefully in her repaired blue gown and walked into the garden with her spine straight and her expression composed, prepared for exactly the kind of scrutiny she now knew to expect. Charlotte Ainsley found her within the first quarter hour, appearing at her elbow near the rose hedges with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Miss Vane, how very fortunate to see you again. I confess I did not expect you to show your face quite so soon." "Miss Ainsley," Elinor replied evenly, "I was not aware my presence required any particular courage." "No, the whole county speaks of little else but your sudden good fortune. Some might even call it remarkable, how quickly a ruined family's daughter has managed to secure a duke's private attention." The words were delivered with the practiced sweetness of a woman who had learned, long ago, that cruelty landed harder when wrapped in a smile, and Elinor felt the familiar flush of humiliation rise in her chest, the same helpless anger she had swallowed so many times over the past 2 years whenever her father's failures were held up for public examination. "I did not seek his attention, Miss Ainsley. He offered it freely, and I accepted a dance, nothing more." "Of course, nothing more." Charlotte's gaze swept over Elinor's repaired gown with a precision that made clear she had noticed every reworked stitch. "How very convenient that nothing more should arrive precisely when your family's finances require rescuing most urgently." Elinor's hands curled at her sides, nails pressing small crescents into her palms beneath her gloves. She thought of her needle and thread, of the sewing room's quiet, exact rhythm, and forced her breathing to slow, refusing to give Charlotte Ainsley the satisfaction of watching her composure crack in front of the assembled garden. "I wonder," Elinor said, keeping her voice level, "whether you find it easier to imagine me scheming than to imagine that a man might simply have chosen honestly, without regard for fortune at all." Something flickered across Charlotte's face then, quick and unguarded, gone before Elinor could fully name it, but she recognized it anyway. Not triumph. Something closer to hurt, the particular hurt of a woman who had spent 4 careful months building toward an outcome that had slipped away from her in the space of a single unplanned dance. Elinor felt, unexpectedly, a small twist of sympathy beneath her own lingering anger. Whatever satisfaction there might have been in winning this small exchange dissolved quickly into something more complicated. The recognition that Charlotte Ainsley was not simply a cruel rival, but another woman caught in the same narrow, unforgiving machinery of expectation and fortune that had shaped Elinor's own difficult years. Neither of them said anything further. Charlotte turned and walked back toward the refreshment table, and Elinor stood alone near the rose hedges for a long moment, breathing carefully, before she noticed the Duke watching her from across the garden, his expression unreadable at that distance, though something in his posture suggested he had witnessed at least part of the exchange. He crossed the lawn toward her with the same unhurried confidence she remembered from the ballroom, though there was a tightness around his eyes now that had not been present during their long conversation in her mother's drawing room. "Miss Vane, I hope Miss Ainsley has not distressed you." "I am quite well, Your Grace." "You do not look quite well." His voice had dropped lower, meant only for her. "You look like a woman holding herself together through sheer will, which I have come to recognize rather well in the past fortnight, since it is precisely how I have spent most of my own conversations of late." Despite herself, Elinor felt the corner of her mouth twitch toward something like a smile. "Your aunt, I take it, has strong opinions on the subject of our acquaintance." "My aunt has opinions on every subject, Miss Vane, but yes, this one occupies her particularly. She informs me, quite regularly, that a duke does not simply dance with a ruined family's daughter without intending something specific by it, and that the county will not forgive ambiguity for very much longer." "And what do you intend, Your Grace?" The question hung between them, sharper than she had meant it to sound, though she found she genuinely wished to know the answer, separate from her mother's hopes and the county's gossip and everything else pressing in on this single, complicated acquaintance. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on her face in a way that made her want to look away and made her equally unable to do so. "I intend," he said slowly, "to determine whether what I feel is genuine before I allow anyone else's expectations to decide the matter for me. I have spent my whole life having decisions made around me by people who claimed to know what was best for the family name. I find I am not eager to let this particular matter be settled the same way." It was not quite the declaration her mother hoped for, nor the dismissal Charlotte Ainsley's cruelty had half suggested was coming. It was something else entirely, cautious and honest and uncertain, and Elinor found she trusted it far more than she would have trusted a grander, more confident promise. "Then I suppose," she said, "we are both determining the same thing at the same uncertain pace." "It would seem so, Miss Vane." They did not speak much longer, aware of the watching garden and the gossip that would inevitably follow from even this brief, quiet exchange near the rose hedges. But as the Duke bowed and moved back toward the other guests, Elinor felt something shift inside her chest, a small, stubborn hope she had not allowed herself since her father's ruin first began, the hope that perhaps not every good thing in her life was destined to be taken away or twisted into something ugly by circumstances beyond her control. That evening, riding home in the family's aging carriage, her aunt chattered eagerly about the garden party's various small dramas, entirely unaware of the deeper undercurrent that had passed between Elinor and the Duke near the rose hedges. Elinor let the older woman's cheerful commentary wash over her without truly listening, her mind still turning over his words, examining them from every angle the way she once examined dance steps, searching for the precise place where honesty and hope might meet without breaking. She did not yet know that the true test of everything between them was still ahead, waiting in a quieter, more private moment than any ballroom or garden could provide. She only knew, watching the darkening countryside pass beyond the carriage window, that whatever came next would require more honesty from her than she had ever dared offer anyone, including herself. The Duke's third visit came without warning, arranged through a hastily written note that arrived only an hour before his carriage appeared at the end of the drive, requesting a walk in the garden rather than the usual formal call in the drawing room. Elinor's mother, delighted by the informality, practically pushed her out the back door with only a shawl thrown over her shoulders against the cool afternoon air. They walked for a while without speaking, following the narrow gravel path that wound between the bare autumn hedges, the silence between them comfortable in a way that surprised her. It was the Duke who finally broke it, stopping near the low stone wall at the garden's far edge, where the property looked out over open fields toward the distant tree line. "I have been giving thought to your earlier question," he said, "about my intentions." Eleanor's heart quickened, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "And have you arrived at an answer, Your Grace?" "I believe I have, though I find I am somewhat nervous in delivering it, which is not an experience I am well accustomed to." There was something almost boyish in the admission, a crack in his usual composed bearing that made her want to reach out and take his hand, an impulse she firmly suppressed. Instead, she waited, watching him gather his thoughts, aware of her own pulse beating faster with every passing second. "I find," he said slowly, "that I think of you constantly, not out of any obligation the county has placed upon me, and not out of any misguided notion of rescue, which I suspect is what half the gossips believe drives me. I think of you because our conversations have felt more honest than any I have had in years, and because I find myself wanting to know what you think, what you feel, in a way I have not wanted with anyone else." Eleanor's breath caught somewhere in her chest, and for a moment the careful control she had maintained through every difficult conversation of the past 2 years threatened to slip entirely. She opened her mouth to respond, uncertain even now what words might come out, when he reached forward and took her hand. It was a small gesture, entirely proper, his gloved fingers closing gently around hers. But something about the sudden, unexpected weight of his touch, the firmness of it, sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the tender words he had just spoken. She was, without warning, no longer standing in a quiet autumn garden with a man whose honesty she had come to trust. She was standing in a different garden, 3 years earlier, when another man's hand had closed around her wrist with far less gentleness. In the last moments before her first engagement had ended in public humiliation, when the news of her father's failing investments had reached her betrothed's family, and he had broken with her in front of half the assembled guests at what was meant to be their formal courtship ball. His hand gripping her wrist hard enough to bruise as he pulled her aside to deliver the news, as if she herself were something faulty to be returned. She had never told anyone the full truth of that night, not her mother, who had enough grief of her own, not her aunt, who would only have fretted uselessly. She had folded the memory away, small and tight, the same way she folded away every difficult thing, and had not expected it to surface here now, in this quiet garden with a man whose hand held hers with nothing but gentleness. "Eleanor." His voice, saying her given name for the first time, pulled her back into the present moment, though her hand had gone rigid within his grip, and she was breathing faster than the moment warranted. "I was thrown back 3 years, she said, before she could stop herself, the words escaping in a small, tight rush that surprised her as much as it clearly surprised him. She did not explain further. She could not yet, the memory still too raw and too close to the surface for elaboration. She simply stood there, breathing hard, her hand still caught in his, waiting to see what he would do with the fragment of truth she had just handed him without meaning to. He did not press her for more. He did not ask the obvious questions, did not demand explanation or context, though she could see the concern gathering in his expression, the careful restraint of a man who understood, somehow, that pushing further would break something rather than mend it. Instead, he simply loosened his grip, giving her hand the freedom to pull away if she wished, though he did not release it entirely, leaving the choice to her. Eleanor did not pull away. She stood very still, feeling the last echo of that old humiliation slowly recede, replaced by something else entirely, a small, sharp anger that rose up familiar and almost welcome, steadying her in a way the panic had not. Anger, she had learned long ago, was easier to hold than grief. Grief left her feeling exposed and helpless, a woman waiting to be pitied or dismissed. Anger gave her something to stand on, solid ground beneath feet that had felt, only a moment before, dangerously unsteady. "I am sorry," she said finally, her voice steadier now though still tight, That was not meant for you. I did not think it was. His voice remained careful, unhurried. You need not explain it to me, Elinor, not now, not unless you wish to. But I would ask that you not apologize for it either. Whatever happened, it clearly still carries weight, and I would rather know that weight exists than have you pretend, for my comfort, that it does not. It was, she thought, exactly the wrong thing and exactly the right thing to say all at once, an acknowledgement without demand, a door left open without pressure to walk through it. She felt something in her chest loosen slightly, some small, guarded piece of herself she had not realized she was still holding so tightly. There was another man, she said, offering only the barest outline, the smallest possible unit of truth. Before my father's ruin became fully known, it ended badly and publicly, and I have not spoken of it since. He did not ask for more. He simply nodded, accepting the fragment for what it was, and after a long moment, gently released her hand entirely, giving her the space to decide for herself whether to close the distance again. She did after a breath, reaching out to take his hand once more, deliberately this time, a small act of trust that felt larger than she expected it to feel. They walked the rest of the garden path in a silence that felt different now, heavier with things half said, but no less honest for remaining unfinished. Elinor understood, as they turned back toward the house, that something had shifted between them in that quiet exchange near the stone wall. Some deeper honesty established that no amount of county gossip could touch, whatever came of it in the days ahead. She did not know yet whether that honesty would be enough to weather everything still standing between them, her family's ruin, his aunt's disapproval, the watching, hungry attention of an entire county eager to see either a scandal confirmed or a fairy tale completed. But for the first time since her father's failures had upended her family's world, she found she was not entirely afraid to find out. You asked me once, he said as they neared the garden gate, what I intended. I gave you an honest answer, but not a complete one. There is something of my own I have not spoken of, not to anyone, and it seems only fair, given what you have just shared, that I offer something in return. Elinor said nothing, only waited, sensing that whatever came next would cost him something to say. My parents did not simply die when I was 12, he said. They died in a manner the family has spent considerable effort keeping quiet, a manner that made the newspapers briefly before my aunt's influence smoothed it over. I have spent 20 years since then learning to perform certainty in every room I enter, because the alternative, showing the world how unsteady I actually felt after losing them so suddenly, was never permitted to a boy who would one day hold a dukedom. He paused, his gaze fixed on some point past the garden wall, out toward the darkening fields. I have been performing ever since. Every conversation weighed for its effect, every decision measured against what the family name requires. I do not think I have said an entirely unguarded thing to another person in longer than I can properly remember, until our conversations began. That is why the honesty matters so much to you, Elinor said quietly, understanding settling over her slowly. Not simply because it is pleasant, because it is rare. Because it is rare, he agreed, and because I find, rather inconveniently for a man in my position, that I have come to need it. Something passed between them then, unspoken but clearly felt, a recognition of two people who had each spent years building careful armor against a world that demanded performance over honesty, finding in each other, almost by accident, the first place either had felt safe enough to set that armor down, even briefly. They did not speak further of it that afternoon. The Duke walked her back to the house, bowed properly over her hand in front of the watching windows, and departed with promises to call again soon, leaving Elinor standing in the entryway with her thoughts in considerable disorder. The disorder did not last long in peace. 2 days later, her aunt returned from the village with news that tightened Elinor's stomach into a hard, not the moment she heard it. Mrs. Ainsley has been telling anyone who will listen, her aunt said, settling into a chair with the particular breathlessness of a woman eager to deliver unwelcome news. that she has written to a cousin in London, a woman with considerable influence in certain circles, regarding the details of your former engagement. She means to have the whole story spread before the Duke commits himself any further, so that he might reconsider before it is, in her words, too late to withdraw honorably. Elinor felt the blood drain from her face. The engagement she had spoken of only in the barest fragments to the Duke, the humiliation she had folded away and never fully unfolded for anyone, was about to become public property again, twisted and retold by strangers who had never witnessed the original cruelty and would feel no obligation to represent it fairly. "She cannot possibly know the particulars," Elinor said, though her voice shook slightly. "She does not need the particulars, child. She needs only enough of the shape of the story to suggest that you have a habit of losing engagements under difficult circumstances, and to let the county's imagination supply whatever details make the tale most damning." Elinor sat down heavily, her hands pressed flat against her knees, steadying herself against the familiar, cold rise of panic. She thought of the Duke's careful honesty in the garden, his own difficult admission about his parents, the fragile trust they had only just begun building between them. She thought of how quickly that trust might shatter if the county's version of her past reached him wrapped in cruelty and speculation, before she had the chance to explain it fully in her own words. She would have to tell him herself completely before Mrs. Ainsley's letter could reach London and return, transformed, as gossip. There was no other way to protect what fragile honesty had begun growing between them. The question was whether he would still want that honesty, once he heard the whole of it. Elinor did not wait for a second letter to arrange her next meeting with the Duke. She wrote to him herself that same evening, requesting a private word at his earliest convenience, and he arrived the following morning, earlier than propriety strictly allowed, his expression already carrying a trace of concern that suggested her carefully worded note had betrayed more urgency than she intended. They walked once more to the low stone wall at the garden's edge, though this time Elinor kept a careful distance between them, needing the space to say what she had come to say without the distraction of his nearness undoing her resolve. "There is something I must tell you," she began, "before someone else tells it first and tells it wrong." She told him everything then, the whole of it, not the careful fragment she had offered before, but the complete shape of that old humiliation. She told him of the engagement formed in the last good year before her father's ruin, to a young man from a respectable family who had seemed, at the time, genuinely fond of her. She told him of the courtship ball, where the news of her father's failing investments had reached his family that very evening, whispered urgently between guests before the young man himself fully understood what was happening. She told him of being pulled aside in front of half the assembled company, his hand closing hard around her wrist, the public, humiliating end of an engagement delivered as though she herself were the failed investment, something purchased in error and now being returned. She told him she had not cried, not once, not that night and not in the weeks that followed, because crying would have given the watching crowd exactly the spectacle they seemed to want, and she had refused, even in her deepest humiliation, to give them that satisfaction. The Duke listened without interruption, his expression carefully controlled, though she could see, in the tightening of his jaw, something that looked very much like anger on her behalf, restrained only by his evident understanding that this was her story to tell in her own way, without his emotion crowding out the telling. When she finished, the garden fell silent except for the distant call of some bird settling into the hedges for the evening. "Mrs. Ainsley intends to have this story spread through London," Elinor said finally, twisted, no doubt, into something far less sympathetic than the truth. "I wished you to hear it honestly from me first, whatever you decide to do with it." "What I decide to do with it," he repeated slowly, and for one terrible moment Elinor braced herself for the possibility that even his careful honesty might not survive contact with the full weight of her past. "Elinor, I do not require deciding anything. The man who treated you so cruelly revealed a great deal about his own character, and nothing at all about yours. If anything, hearing this only confirms what I have already come to believe, that you are a woman of considerable strength, who has carried a genuinely difficult burden with more grace than most people could manage. Relief moved through her so suddenly that she felt almost unsteady with it, a loosening in her chest she had not realized she was still bracing against. Mrs. Ainsley may spread whatever version of this story she pleases, he continued. I find I no longer have much patience for a county that measures a woman's worth by the cruelty other people have inflicted upon her. Let them talk. I have grown rather tired of arranging my life around what talkative people expect of me. There was, in that moment, a fierce quality to his voice she had not heard before, a decisiveness that suggested something in him had finally settled, some final hesitation resolved. There is to be a ball at my own estate next week, he said. My aunt has been planning it for months, ostensibly to celebrate the season's harvest, though we both know its true purpose has become rather more specific in recent weeks. I would like you to attend, Elinor, not as a rumor or a scandal to be managed, but as my acknowledged and honored guest. Your aunt will object. My aunt has objected to a great many things throughout my life. I have found that objecting does not always mean she is right, and in this particular matter, I find I care far less for her objections than I once might have. Elinor felt something rise in her chest that she did not immediately recognize as hope, having spent so long guarding against exactly that feeling, wary of how quickly hope could be crushed by circumstances beyond her control. But standing there in the quiet garden, with the Duke's steady gaze fixed on her face and his earlier anger on her behalf still faintly visible beneath his composed exterior, she allowed herself, cautiously, to hope anyway. Then I will attend, she said. The week that followed passed in a strange blur of anticipation and dread in equal measure. Mrs. Ainsley's letter, as predicted, produced its intended ripple of gossip, though the story that returned from London some days later had grown so distorted from the original truth that Elinor found she could hardly recognize herself in it. She was, according to the wildest version, a woman who had broken not one but several engagements, each time abandoning her intended the moment a wealthier prospect appeared. It bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened, and yet she found, to her own surprise, that it stung considerably less than she expected it to. Perhaps it was the Duke's steady support in the days since her confession. Perhaps it was simply that she had finally spoken the truth aloud to someone who mattered, and found that the truth, once released from its careful hiding place, no longer held quite the same power over her. The night of the ball arrived clear and cold, the estate's great house blazing with candlelight visible from a considerable distance down the long approach. Elinor wore her repaired blue gown, the same one she had mended with such careful attention in the quiet sewing-room weeks earlier, and found, standing before her small mirror while her aunt fussed anxiously with her hair, that she felt steadier than she had any reasonable right to feel, given everything that hung upon the evening ahead. The ballroom, when she entered it, was even grander than the one where the first waltz had taken place. Its high ceilings hung with candles that multiplied their light in tall mirrors along every wall. Elinor felt the familiar weight of watching eyes settle upon her the moment she crossed the threshold, though this time she recognized many of the faces among the crowd, having encountered them at countless assemblies over the past difficult weeks. The Duke's aunt intercepted her before she had gone more than a few steps into the room, her expression carefully neutral in the particular way of a woman determined not to reveal her true feelings to a room full of watching guests. Miss Vane, the Dowager Duchess said, my nephew has spoken to me at some length about your circumstances. I confess I remain uncertain whether his judgment in this matter is entirely sound, but I have known Julian long enough to recognize when further argument would only harden his resolve rather than soften it. I do not ask for your approval, Your Grace, Elinor said carefully, only for the chance to be judged honestly on my own conduct, rather than on stories twisted by other people's cruelty. Something in the older woman's expression eased slightly at that, a small crack in her careful composure. That, at least, is a fair enough request. We shall see, Miss Vane, whether you prove worth the considerable trouble my nephew seems determined to invite upon this family. It was not quite acceptance, but it was not outright rejection either, and Elinor found she could work with that uncertain middle ground far more comfortably than she could have worked with either extreme. The Duke found her shortly after, cutting across the crowded floor with the same purposeful stride she remembered from their very first meeting weeks earlier. He bowed properly, formally, in full view of the assembled guests, and asked, in a voice pitched to carry to every curious ear in the room, whether she would honor him with the opening waltz. The request was, on its surface, identical to the one that had started this entire complicated chain of events. But Elinor understood, standing there with 300 watching eyes fixed upon her once more, that everything beneath the surface had changed entirely. This was not a duke testing an unknown quantity, nor a woman accepting out of fear that refusal would create a scandal larger than acceptance. This was two people who had spent difficult weeks building something honest between them, choosing now, deliberately and in full view of a county that had doubted them at every turn, to claim that honesty publicly. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she said, and placed her hand in his. The music began. They moved together into the familiar frame of the waltz, and Elinor found, as the first turn carried them across the floor, that her body remembered the steps just as easily as it had the first time, though everything else about the moment felt entirely transformed. There was no fear pressing against her chest now, no desperate need to control every movement as armor against a hostile world. There was only the steady warmth of his hand at her waist, the clear, unclouded honesty in his eyes as he watched her, and the growing certainty, settling deeper into her with every turn of the dance, that whatever the county chose to believe about them, the truth between herself and Julian Ashcombe belonged to no one but the two of them. Near the edge of the dance floor, close to where the musicians had gathered, she noticed a fine layer of chalk dust scattered across the polished wood, placed there earlier in the evening by careful servants to help dancing slippers glide smoothly across the floor. It was the same small detail she had fixed her attention upon during that very first waltz, weeks earlier, when she had needed something ordinary and unbothered to anchor her against 300 watching eyes. This time, as the dance carried them past that same stretch of floor, she looked down and saw not a single stranger's careless mark but their own footprints, hers and his, moving together in matched, deliberate steps across the pale dust, leaving a pattern that belonged entirely to the two of them. The final note of the waltz faded into a long moment of silence, the same particular silence that had followed their first dance weeks earlier, 300 guests deciding, all at once, what story they would tell about what they had just witnessed. But this time, Elinor found she did not fear whatever story they chose to tell. She had told her own story honestly, to the one person whose understanding truly mattered, and had found, in his steady and unwavering response, something considerably more valuable than the county's fickle approval. The Duke bowed over her hand, straightened, and did not release her fingers entirely, holding them instead with a quiet, deliberate certainty that needed no further words to explain itself. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, meant only for her. "I find I am no longer interested in performing anything for anyone's benefit but our own." "Nor am I, Your Grace," Elinor said, and found, as the ballroom slowly returned to its usual murmur of music and conversation around them, that she meant it entirely. The candles burned steadily on. The chalk dust settled once more beneath 100 dancing feet, and somewhere in that bright, crowded room, two people who had each spent years learning to guard themselves against a demanding world stood together, quietly unguarded at last, no longer performing anything except, perhaps, the simple, honest truth of having finally found someone worth being unguarded for. In the weeks that followed, the county's gossip did not vanish entirely, for gossip rarely disappears so cleanly, but it shifted its shape considerably, softening into something closer to genuine curiosity than outright cruelty. Mrs. Ainsley's letter from London arrived back home eventually, its wildest claims quietly deflated by the simple, undeniable fact of the Duke's continued and very public attention toward Elinor, an attention that no amount of twisted retelling could easily undo. Charlotte Ainsley herself, to Elinor's genuine surprise, sought her out at a small gathering not long after the ball, her manner considerably more subdued than it had been near the rose hedges weeks earlier. "I did not behave well toward you," Charlotte said, without preamble, twisting her gloved hands together in a gesture that suggested the apology cost her something to offer. "I was frightened, I think, of what your family's difficulties might mean for my own prospects, and frightened people are rarely kind people. I am sorry for it." Elinor considered her for a long moment, remembering the flash of hurt she had glimpsed beneath Charlotte's cruelty in the garden that day, and found she could not hold onto her earlier resentment with quite the same firmness. "We were both caught in the same difficult machinery," Elinor said finally. "I do not think either of us chose the rules we were forced to play by." It was not quite friendship that grew between them after that exchange, but it became something considerably warmer than rivalry, the beginning of an understanding between two women who had each learned, in their own different ways, how heavily the world weighed a woman's worth against her fortune and her family's reputation. Her mother's hope, meanwhile, found its careful, quiet vindication over the following month, as the Duke's visits grew steadily more frequent and considerably less formal, until it became something of an open secret throughout the county that a proposal was simply a matter of time rather than uncertainty. Elinor watched her mother's exhausted shoulders ease, week by week, watched some of the old brightness return to her expression that had been absent since the worst of her father's ruin first became known, and found her own happiness tangled inseparably with the relief of watching her family's long burden finally begin to lift. The proposal itself, when it came, held none of the grand ceremony the county might have expected from a duke. Julian found her alone in the same quiet garden where she had first confessed the truth of her broken engagement, standing near the same low stone wall, and simply took her hand without preamble, the same steady, deliberate grip she had come to trust so completely in the weeks since that difficult conversation. "I find I have grown rather attached to honesty," he said, "and to the particular woman who taught me to value it above performance. I do not intend to spend the rest of my life pretending otherwise, Elinor, in front of you or anyone else. Will you marry me?" She did not need to consider her answer, though she took a moment anyway, simply to feel the full weight of the moment settle over her, the strange, quiet arrival of a happiness she had not truly believed herself entitled to during the 2 long years of her family's difficulty. "Yes," she said, "though I would ask one thing of you first." "Anything." "No grand public ceremony where the county gathers merely to watch and judge. Let our happiness, at least, remain something quiet and honestly our own, before the world claims its share of it as well." He smiled then, the same rare, unguarded smile she had glimpsed only a handful of times since their first dance, and pressed a gentle kiss to her gloved knuckles. "I believe," he said, "that can be arranged." They were married in the small village church the following spring, in a ceremony considerably quieter than either family's rank might have suggested, attended by close relations and a handful of genuine friends rather than the full spectacle of county society. Elinor wore a new gown for the occasion, her first in over 2 years, though she privately kept the old repaired blue one carefully folded away in a chest, unwilling to part with the small, exact stitches that had steadied her through so many difficult weeks. Her father's debts, resolved through a combination of the Duke's quiet generosity and her mother's careful, long-practiced economy, ceased to hang over the family's future like a permanent shadow. Her mother, in time, returned fully to society, no longer avoiding balls out of shame, but attending them instead with the quiet satisfaction of a woman whose daughter had found genuine happiness rather than merely a convenient rescue. As for Elinor herself, she found in the years that followed that she never quite lost the habit of noticing small, ordinary details in moments of great consequence: the chalk dust on a ballroom floor, the exact tension of a well-mended seam, the particular steadiness of a hand closing gently around her own. They remained her anchors, the small true things she reached for whenever the larger world grew too loud or too demanding. Exactly as they had been on the night a duke crossed a crowded ballroom and requested, with deceptive simplicity, a single ordinary waltz. It had not, in the end, been simple at all, but it had been honest, and Elinor Vane, once a ruined baronet's daughter dancing carefully through a world that expected her to disappear, had learned that honesty, however difficult to offer, was worth considerably more than any performance she might have chosen instead.